Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about what was going on between the wars, what was happening in Europe and America between the 1920s and the 1930s before we get the major interruption of World War II. And it basically comes down to surrealism and abstraction. And then, of course, America is always different. It's got to go its own way. And so it has this thing we call regionalism, but we'll get there in a bit. Let's start with surrealism. So surrealism just means literally something that is above or beyond the real, a kind of super reality. And it can be conceived of as a branch of Dadaism. Many of the people that were involved in Dadaism, Max Ernst, Hugo Ball, etc., moved over into the surrealist movement. Dadaism was all about smashing the establishment. It was all about destroying the nature of art itself. But at some point, you've done that. You've totally unhinged the apple cart, so to speak, and thrown it over and folded it into interdimensional space. That's what Dadaism did. You've really since, destroyed the whole concept of art. What are you going to do? You're going to keep making art, and you're going to look for something to build around. And that's really what defines surrealism. Surrealism was kind of on the idea that, well, hey, we've tried everything else. What is the way to go forward? And it's interesting that Dadaism was all about the deconstruction of meaning. Art has no meaning. It's pointless. It's this masturbatory thing that we do to appease ourselves. It makes us feel good about ourselves, but it's no different than the baser instincts. It's just garbage. It's nonsense. And surrealism actually kind of goes the opposite direction. It says, no, there is meaning, but we're not going to go back to the old meanings of Christianity or God, king, and country, the kind of stuff that existed before the war. Instead, we're going to find new meaning. And so they start looking for that new meaning in a very interesting place. They start looking for it in the theories of Sigmund Freud. And so this is where Sigmund Freud comes into the scene. Now, Sigmund Freud had been working for quite some time in both Vienna and in London, and he was the father of modern psychology in many ways. Now, many of Freud's theories today are not really considered the most up-to-date, but there were a couple of concepts that he introduced. The first is the idea of psychoanalysis, that you should talk out your anxieties. Now, this really came to the fore because of World War I. Generally, people did not have a very high opinion of people with shell shock. They were regarded as people of weak moral character. They were regarded as cowards. And so the way you dealt with people who suffered from shell shock and war is you literally flogged them, or you imprisoned them, or sometimes you executed them for cowardice or desertion. But in World War I, the shell shock or the trauma, the PTSD of war, was so severe you simply couldn't do it. There were too many. There were thousands and thousands of soldiers that you had to take care of, and you simply couldn't flog them all or house them all. And so it's rather kind of ironic, but they were desperate to do something to rehabilitate their soldiers, to make them into effective soldiers again, and so they turned to the latest trend, which was psychoanalysis, what they called the talking cure. Because the way psychoanalysis worked is, I'm sure you've seen the cliche. This is actually Freud's therapy couch. He would ask his clients to lay down. He would look at them. He would actually sit behind them so that they could, weren't looking like they were being investigated. And in a very humanistic way, he would ask them how they're feeling, ask them how they felt about that. And this form of psychoanalysis took many, many different forms, but the idea was to get at their anxieties, to help them process their own anxieties. And amazingly, it worked. It absolutely overcame these people's anxieties. And, well, I wouldn't say overcame. It allowed them to manage their anxieties, is a better way of dealing it, and manage with this war trauma. So it's rather ironic that the first successful mass test of psychoanalysis was in getting people to go back into the horrors of World War I. But it's true. And so the talking cure became increasingly popular. It was the first real acid test of psychology as a venture. And the first psychoanalysis clinic opened in New York City in 1922. There were earlier ones in Europe, but that was when it first came to the United States. And it suddenly became acceptable to talk about your feelings, your anxieties in a professional context. Now, why is this important to the study of art history? I know what you're thinking. Why? How is this important? Well, if you are a surrealist, if you are someone who was at that time, you need a new avenue, you need a new wellspring for inspiration for art. And unfortunately, all of the other old wellsprings, the church, religion, faith, they all seemed to have fallen apart. Even the faith in society as a whole had kind of fallen apart because of the horrors of World War I. But the self was a new avenue of self-exploration, and the self could, in theory, be an endless avenue of exploration. I know it's really kind of interesting, but we live in a very therapeutic age. We live in the benefit of hundreds of, 100 years of psychoanalysis, where we understand that if you have trauma, anxiety, it's good to talk to someone. One could make the case that we are perhaps too therapeutic, that we could deal with a little bit more of the old-fashioned stoicism. But we're very comfortable speaking about ourselves and our identities and our issues, and we fully accept that that's a normal thing to do. That wasn't a normal thing to do 100 years ago. 100 years ago, you were not supposed to talk to about your problems. Going all the way back to the 19th century and the Victorian era, you were supposed to have this stiff upper lip. You were supposed to have this incredibly stoic nature. You didn't talk about your problems. My wife had a grandfather who served in 2 different theaters in World War II, and he almost never spoke about the experience because it was seen as a kind of example of weak moral character. You were inferior or cowardly if you broke down. He saw endless horrors. And thank goodness we're not like that anymore. But it never would have occurred to artists before this that the self was the ultimate source of expression. If you look at contemporary art today, it's amazing how incredibly autobiographical it is. How much of it is dependent upon the identity of the artist. If you look at the art we've looked at, a lot of it wasn't coming out of the identity of the artist. It was coming out of the world around them, politics, whatever. But drawing solely on your own identity, on your own internal, subconscious was really something of a marvel. And so it became okay to talk about your own issues and yourself. And this was incredibly liberating for a lot of artists because, let's be honest, we're all unique, and if every artist is talking about their own internal struggles, that's an almost bottomless hole of potentiality there, good and bad. One could make the argument that we may be taking it too far, that contemporary art is too self-centered, it's too hyper-individualized, it has no resonance across a group, it's just purely this delving into individual, identity. Maybe that's the case. Well, I'll save that for one of my contemporary classes. But I think you have to realize how liberating this is. By the 1950s, of course, you have, Charles Schulz doing the Peanuts, and you have Lucy, and Lucy, instead of showing up at a lemonade stand, actually has a psychiatry stand. And it shows you that idea had become mainstream by the 1950s and 60s. But it wasn't mainstream at this time. It really took this amazing moment to prove that, hey, there were better ways to do it. So we have to give Freud credit for really changing dramatically the nature of mental health for the better. But there was something else, and that was his interpretation of dreams. Freud really pioneered this idea of a subconscious. That is, that there is something that you cannot access, a level of thought that is happening in your brain that you are not necessarily aware of. It is the subconscious. Many of these terms were pioneered by Freud. And so now, imagine this. You are an artist, you come across the writings of Freud, and Freud not only gives you the justification and the validation to explore your own mind and your own self, he actually gives you a vocabulary and a mechanism for doing it. And in 1899, Freud published his interpretation of dreams. And this was, to him, a way of exploring the subconscious. There are many different ways that people tried to get into the subconscious. You've heard of the Freudian slip. This is where you mean to say one thing, but you accidentally say another. That was considered to be a way of revealing your secret subconscious wish. Another way of doing it was to have you look at ink blots or Rorschach tests, or to do word associations. The idea that somehow you could access your subconscious, the things that you weren't consciously aware of that were nevertheless impacting your psyche negatively. And one of the ways you could do that was through dreams. And, or at least this was Freud's theory, that dreams were some kind of mark of the subconscious. They were either a subconscious anxiety or a secret wish that you had repressed, and you could interpret these dreams and thereby gain access to your subconscious. Now, this is a huge change in the understanding of dreams. The understanding of dreams before this was that dreams were, in a religious sense, were omens or visions from beyond. They were supernatural. Or it was the belief that they were just, nonsense, that they didn't really reveal something. And he was like, no, that the dreams are revealing, but they're not omens or revelations from the supernatural. They're something about us. They're reconstructions of our memories throughout the day. And everything in the dream could be interpreted. And because of Freud's proclivities, he interpreted a lot of these dreams in a sexual way. And Freud was the first person to do a psychoanalytical interpretation of a work of art. He actually wrote a paper about Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci kept a dream journal, because of course he did. And in that dream journal, he described a bird coming out of his mouth. And so Freud interpreted this as a sexual metaphor. What else could it possibly be to Freud? Freud was kind of hung up on those. Most people don't accept that interpretation today. Most people believe that the bird coming out of the mouth is usually was a medieval sign of inspiration, and so Freud kind of got it wrong. But the ability of opening up this avenue for exploration was huge to the world, and huge to the world of art and art analysis. Now, it's a lot harder to push it in the past. Psychoanalytical theory and Freudian theory didn't exist in the past, so you always have to take interpretations from before the time with Freud with a grain of salt. But once people were aware of Freud's theories, oh yeah, they could absolutely assimilate this. And so, artists started adopting the language of dreams, that dreams became a way of accessing meaning. Remember, we had destroyed meaning by the time we get to the Dadaists, so now your dreams became a source of meaning. And another feature of it is the concept of automatism. Automatism, or psychic automatism, is a concept pioneered by Hugo Ball. He said, psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally by means of the written word or in any other manner the actual functioning of thought. What he meant by that, excuse me, not Hugo Ball, André Breton. I'm sorry, I confused Hugo Ball and André Breton there. Bad art historian. So André Breton wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, and he made this argument that spontaneous action, much in the same way as word associations or reading ink blots, in art was a way of getting at the subconscious. And so you actually have a whole new level of meaning that is created. And you have two fundamental branches of surrealism that merge. One is dreamscape surrealism, where you use the visual vocabulary that has been opened up by Freud, and you use it to create new imagery. And that's why it's called dreamscape, because it's like a landscape, but it uses this nightmarish or dreamlike imagery. The other form is going to be biomorphism. And biomorphism is where you just start painting spontaneously, and you just let your hands go, and the hope that they will automatically just create forms. This is the psychic automatism, this attempt to capture the subconscious to generate forms without deliberate intention or will. So whether it's biomorphism or whether it's dreamscape surrealism, both of these fundamentally have their origin in Freud and his theories. And so he's going to be something like a patron saint to the Surrealists. What's funny is he actually didn't like this. He lived long enough to see this happen, and all of these Surrealists were using Freud's theories to justify their works of art, and he felt that they didn't really understand their works of his. They didn't understand his theories at all. He thought this was kind of ad hoc until he actually met Salvador Dalí. And he sat down with Salvador Dalí. Salvador Dalí painted a portrait of him. And in the process, he discovered that Salvador Dalí was a very thoughtful person who was very into these kind of higher concepts. And Freud flipped. He went from someone who was deeply suspicious of the use of the Surrealists of his theories to someone said, no, okay, I get it. I get it. I understand it. It's good. And so it's one of the few times where, the theory and the reality actually kind of came to a certain harmony. So let's jump into this. Let's talk about some of these Surrealists. One of the early Surrealists is going to be Max Ernst. Max Ernst was a German painter, and he was a member of the Dadaist and Surrealist movements, of course, active in Germany, Paris, and America. And he was really borrowing on some of that dreamlike imagery that we saw back in the metaphysical pictures by de Chirico with Dadaist collage. And he actually runs the gambit. His stuff is both dreamscape surrealism and also biomorphic surrealism. In dreamscape, he would create bizarre kind of fantasies, as you can see here. Sometimes these would be rather humorous. This is the Virgin spanking the child, the Christ child before three witnesses, which include André Breton, Paul Eluard, and the painter himself, Max Ernst. And so here he is, overturning images. That was a large feature of surrealism. You took something that was familiar and it would become twisted. The Virgin Mary would have no reason to spank the Christ child. So, of course, this becomes an inversion of the idea. And, as I mentioned, it's also deeply personal. The artist is often included, in this case, literally, in the picture. But he also would create spontaneous paintings. This one is called Forest and Dove, where in this case, he didn't start with any particular picture in mind. He would simply work the paint onto the canvas, and it would start to create forms. And as these forms suggested images to him, he would then solidify them into other forms. And so we have biomorphic forms, forms that are like biological forms, but only in the suggestion of biological forms. One of the more prominent kind of dreamscape surrealists would be René Magritte, who was this Belgian painter who's very famous for working in visual puns and also double entendres and innuendos. He's most famous for creating these images that fundamentally challenge the nature of reality itself. I love this one. This is the Human Condition 1. And of course, what you're seeing is an open window. Now, one has to keep in mind this whole thing is a painting. And this is a painting inside a painting. But let's just accept the fictive reality of the painting for a moment. If we do accept the fictive reality of the painting, this is a window looking out onto a vista. But the artist here has set up an easel with a painting that has obscured but also reveals nature. And this, of course, is why this is called the human condition. If you have a window that looks out onto nature, why would you paint an image of that? Why not just use the window? Of course, that begs the question, is this painting an actual true representation of what's behind it? Can we trust the painting? Of course, the answer is not. There might be some car up on blocks there, or abandoned, vehicle or trash. Who knows what could be back there? We don't know if it's reality. And of course, the whole thing is fake anyway, because the whole thing is a painting. So he's talking about how humans generate images, how we generate lies and tell ourselves lies. This, of course, is probably best revealed in one of his most famous paintings, The Treachery of Images. Of course, for those of you who read French, you know that the phrase at the bottom says, "This is not a pipe," which seems bizarre because it's apparently very clearly a pipe. But of course, it's not a pipe. What is it? It's an image of a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. And that's an entirely different thing. An image is not reality. We take for granted the relation of the image and reality. In my 2710 survey course, this is the first image I show in the first lecture, because something that's very important people have to know about images. As Picasso said, an image is a lie that somehow tells the truth. And that's what an image is. People thought he was being pretentious when he did this, and in fact, they said, oh, come on, get off your high horse, it's a pipe. And he said, no, if it's a pipe, take it down off the wall, fill it full of tobacco, and go smoke it. Which you can't. It's an image of a pipe. It's a concept of a pipe. And so images are, by their very nature, even if they're very realistic, somehow untruthful. That's why he talks about the treachery of images. And yet, they represent some kind of truth, a kind of subconscious truth. He was often playing with this nature of imagery. What is the nature of imagery? I love this one. This one's kind of a self-portrait of him painting a bird. This one's called Clairvoyance. But of course, the bird hasn't been hatched yet. He often reverses cause and effect. And he created some of the most lasting images in Surrealism. This one called The Son of Man, where the apple, again, probably a reference to the fall of man, and the apple in the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, displaces the face of a person in a bowler hat. He himself would go around wearing a bowler hat, and of course bowler hats and overcoats were associated with bankers, accountants, government officials, people who were officials, people in a position of authority and respect. And yet this casts us in a very bizarre light, letting us know something is not quite right here. And of course the Son of Man is a reference to a title given to Jesus Christ himself. So there's all these subtle images and connotations. There's no one hard reading of Magritte's stuff. In fact, there's no one hard reading of any of the Surrealists. Neither did they intend there to be a single hard reading. You are allowed a window into their mind, and it is sometimes not a pleasant place, let alone a very clear or didactic place. Probably the most famous of all the dreamscape surrealists would be Salvador Dalí. Salvador Dalí actually started as a cubist and painted in a cubist style. He was starting, very much in the interests of what the cubists were doing. He was very much interested in what the Dadaists were doing. And so we see that he brought that kind of experimental nature with him. But he also had a very high academic training. He himself was very much in love with the Spanish Baroque masters, and so when we look at his paintings, his still lifes, they evoke the works of Velázquez, of Zurbarán, of Ribera, and quite a few others that came out of the Spanish Baroque period. There is a kind of precision to his work. Eventually, he would combine these two things together. He is infamous for being one of the people who worked on the Andalusian Dog. The Andalusian Dog was one of the first experimental films. You can find it on YouTube. I don't recommend going to it if you have to sleep in the next 24 hours. It was one of the first attempts at complete disjointed filmmaking. There's no real narrative. There's just a string of disturbing images. Perhaps the most disturbing images is where they apparently rake a razor across the eye of this woman here. I won't show it to you. It's a little bit gory. They faked this by, once the razor got very close to her eye, they moved to a close-up of a razor cutting a sheep's eye that they had gotten from a butcher. But oh my gosh, the squick factor, the ew, is really intense. And it showed that they were thinking very broadly. By the time of the 1930s, he is going to formalize into what is going to be the style he's going to follow for the rest of his life. Again, that's amazing to me to think that Salvador Dalí lived until, oh my gosh, was it the 1980s or 1990s? I don't remember off the top of my head. But he lived a good long time, eventually retiring to Spain. But he creates this dreamlike imagery, and he will stick with this pretty much for the rest of his life. It's going to involve landscapes. There's often paintings that reference Majorca, his kind of beloved Spanish home, but also disturbing imagery. This one is probably one of the most famous surrealist paintings in the world, and yet it's also one of the most inexplicable. We have a loose biological form that drapes over the landscape. Rigid things like clocks are also melting and moving. The title, The Persistence of Memory, doesn't really give us any great insights to it. We have insects trapped in a clock like amber, and we also have insects on the clock. It gives a sense that time is fleeting, but at the same time not permanent. It is, morpho. It has this ability to change. It can be transformed. You can see that also in this work. A lot of these painters and artists, of course, were sympathizing with the Marxist international revolutions, and particularly they sympathized with the Marxists in the Spanish Civil War. He, being Spanish by blood, took it even harder. And so here we have this wonderful thing called Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, and it's also kind of subtitled The Premonition of Civil War. It relates to the Civil War in Spain. We have a figure in the background. We have the deep landscape. On one level, this looks very much like a painting by perhaps El Greco or Velázquez with this deep background. But then we have the odd metaphors of the beans. Then we have these strange biomorphic shapes. They have real dimension, but they look monstrous. This hand grips a breast and pulls it. We have things that indicate pain or suffering. You can see this in some of his later works as well. This one is the Geopoliticus child watching the birth of the new man. This one probably relates to the outcome of World War II. Notice that the new man is hatched from an egg. There is blood bringing him into being. We have a figure that is almost like a Eve-like figure, and a child waiting anxiously. She points to the old world, which is Europe, but the new man is emerging from the new world, that is America. And then we have again this deep landscape and this strange canopy. It is a world of anxiety. Clearly, the world was a world of anxiety in the late 30s and World War II, and the sense that America was emerging as a new world power must have given people who were Europeans a great deal of anxiety, and I think this dreamlike space gives that. Salvador Dalí himself has a kind of interesting life history. He was an avowed atheist early in his life and joined up with the Marxists and the Marxist cause, but of course the Marxists lost in the Spanish Civil War. They were pushed out by the fascist forces of Franco, and so he ended up in exile for most of the 1930s and into World War II. But at the end of World War II, a couple of things happened. He rediscovered his Catholic faith of his childhood and seems to sincerely have gone back to his native Catholicism, and he also wished to return to Spain. And Spain was under the control of Franco. Franco continued to rule Spain right up until the 1970s. So it's interesting that, we fought this war against the fascists in World War II, and we managed to get rid of Mussolini and Hitler, but we didn't get rid of Franco. Franco remained neutral in the war, and we decided to leave him out of it. So fascism continued in Spain. And of course, if you're Franco and you're a fascist, you're going to demand that if someone wants to come back to Spain, that they're going to, kowtow to the fascist regime. And he did. He did because he wanted to be part of, he wanted to return to his native Spain. And he was never forgiven for that. I remember we talked earlier how all of these movements were intensely political, most of them somewhere on the Marxist-fascist divide. And a lot of the artists of the time refused to forgive him for that this was a kind of betrayal. But as you look at his later works, you can see that they start to take on a much more pronounced spiritual dimension. This is the temptation of Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony, of course, is the saint in the desert who is plagued by demons, and the demons come as these gigantic elephants on stalk-like legs. They have obelisks and temples, and in the temples are idols and figures and breasts and figures of lust and torment. And what a better way to kind of communicate this wonderful spiritual moment than through the medium of surrealism. And this is something he continued throughout his life. And he became a kind of living icon. People often accused him of being a fraud, but I think that's kind of hard to do. I think he kind of sincerely you know, embrace this. I mean, there's nobody forcing him to paint these religious scenes later in his life. I think he just fundamentally decided to explore it. And so here we have in the background a scene that is supposed to represent the Sea of Galilee, but of course it's his native Spain. We have the overreaching arms of what is probably God the Father, but also emulates Christ on the cross. And then we have a young and youthful, beardless Christ at a table where all of the other 12 apostles are gathered. If you look at the bread and the reflection of light through the glass, it's just beautiful. You know, it shows off his high academic style, but then the strange forms, it brings this kind of dreamlike scape to it. Dalí, again, continued to be a rather eclectic individual. I won't play this for you, but you can go look it out online. He would stage events. He staged his rebirth, where he and his wife emerged from a gigantic egg in a kind of surrealist, you know, performance. He was fond of saying, the only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad. That is, that he really understood what he was doing, but what he was doing was for the sake of the imagery. He had a point to make to kind of communicate and move this imagery. One of the other prominent surrealists that we should talk about is Frida Kahlo. I, again, won't talk too much about her here, because if you want to talk about her, come listen to my Latin American class. It'll be up in the spring, and you can either sign up for that or wait for the YouTube videos, because they'll drop eventually. But Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera, so she was very active in both politics and in Marxist politics. Heck, when Trotsky got on the outs with Stalin, Trotsky fled to Mexico and actually stayed in the home of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and had an affair with Frida Kahlo, which is kind of fascinating. But she herself embraced this kind of surrealist imagery, creating all of this kind of intense drama. Many of her paintings deal with her tempestuous relationship with Diego Rivera. They were married, had affairs on each other, divorced, married again. And you can see the two Fridas. What's interesting here is that they represent her two roles, her kind of native Mexican identity, but also her modern identity. I love how their hearts are connected together by an artery, and she actually has a pair of forceps holding the vein. In the other hand, she holds a hat, and this isn't just any hat. This is actually Diego Rivera's hat, showing the importance that he was to this relationship. This one is, again, deeply autobiographical. She suffered from a terrible bus accident when she was a young woman, and this rendered her basically crippled for the rest of her life and infertile, and this caused her a great deal of pain. So this thing looks very much like ex votos, these traditions of painting on tin or copper plate that existed in Mexico, where saints would have these torments upon them, and they would be put as votive offerings for being released from the pain. So she has internalized her Mexican heritage here. She shows the trust that she had to wear for most of her life. Her spine is depicted as a shattered column, and then you can see the nails driven into her flesh and the tears coming from her eyes. So like a lot of surrealist painters, her works are deeply, deeply autobiographical and are explorations of their own identity. The last one that we'll talk about before we move on is going to be Joan Miró. Joan Miró was, again, another Spanish artist active in Paris, but he's principally one of the major artists that pushes this concept of biomorphism and psychic automatism. He said, in a picture, it should be possible to discover new things every time you see it. But you could look at a picture for a week together and never think of it again. You can also look at a picture for a second and think of it all your life. He wanted these things to be experimental. And in his early works, he does employ a kind of haphazard method of composition. He starts with the dreamlike imagery, but just paints forms until they start to suggest something. You can see the tilted up perspective here, the flatness, the way this room over here has just been rendered almost as an open space. It's like a chicken coop here. with animals, but we have all of this flat and kind of unrealistic space. As he moves into biomorphism, the way this works is he would just attack the canvas and create a form, and as the form began to suggest an idea, it would be formulated into that idea. So when he started this, he didn't start trying to create these strange creatures or versions of cats or animals or guitars or, floating eyeballs. That was not his goal. He started painting, and as the forms came to his subconscious, he would look at what he had painted, and then he would resolve it into strange things like long arms or bizarre faces. You can see that especially here in this painting, A Dutch Interior. The Dutch interior, of course, is supposed to reference not only Dutch art, but Dutch houses, and we have a figure here playing a lute with a window on the left. That's very typical of Dutch art, but it's the barest suggestion there, and instead everything gets created out of these biomorphic forms. Eventually, he will leave the need for heavy representation at all. And some of his paintings, these biomorphic forms, these psychic automatic forms that just come out of his brush, don't have any resolution, or if they do have a resolution, the resolution is going to be very abstract. This is not an attempt to create a coherent scene. This is an attempt to illustrate the interior dialogue or the subconscious the way dreamscape surrealists painted. It's instead an attempt to express it, and that's all the difference in the world. You don't want to illustrate it. The dreamscape people are trying to illustrate their interior anxieties and identities, etc., some a little bit more concrete than others. This is not an attempt to illustrate it. It's an attempt to get it out onto the canvas in an expressive format. And as this expressive format forms, you form faces and forms into it, but ultimately the forms and the faces are secondary. As he goes on, and as abstraction becomes increasingly important to world art, he gets away from pure, he gets away from figuration and moves into kind of pure abstract forms. What amazes me about surrealism is how much power it continues to have. Surrealism, dominated European visual culture from most of the 30s into the 40s. But really things had moved on, and yet surrealism continues to be very captivating. This is from a very famous party that was held by the Rothschilds. Rothschilds is a very wealthy, prestigious family, banking family in Europe, and they held a very exclusive surrealist ball where individuals came and were, in costumes mimicking surrealist painters. Here's a couple of famous people. Hopefully you recognize this. This is Audrey Hepburn, very famous Dutch-American actress. And so you can see how these forms are created and how it continued to resonate with people. And it still does. Salvador Dalí's works continue to, really resonate with people and continue to be valuable and important sources of kind of visual culture. Their instant recognition of some of these forms and identities. René Magritte's, figures wound up in the, being represented on the films of the Beatles, for example, and Yellow Submarine and other places. These kind of figures ended up being very, very influential when we got to the psychedelic 60s and 70s, and they're still going strong today. Surrealism is one of these movements that really has legs. I still, see elements of surrealism right up until the current day. I think you will always will. I think we've achieved a certain democratization in the art where, if the art isn't going to be directly political or social, it's going to be fundamentally about identity, and surrealism was the first to explore individual identity to this degree. Well, if Europe is going one way, America's going to go another. America is just different. And America between the wars was a very different place. What's interesting is that Europe has this descent into fascism. It has this incredible economic turmoil in the 20s. It has the vibrancy of, Berlin and the Weimar Republic and elsewhere, but it quickly descends into fascism. Nazis come to power, 32, 33, and really it's just the ramp up to war. America gets kind of a break from history. We have the 1920s. It was this huge economic boom for America. Of course, America didn't suffer the pain of World War I. We fought over there, but none of those battles, of course, ever touched us. We were, across an ocean, kind of untouchable. And so America retreats into the Jazz Age, but then shortly after that, we have the Great Depression, we have the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. And so there's going to be a lot different art movements that's happening in America. The first and foremost art movement is what ends up being called regionalism. And the reason it's called regionalism is because every region of America has a kind of different flavor. America is a very big country, and as is evident today, there are strong divisions between coastal elites and interior people living in what they call flyover country. And there's different kind of feelings about this country. This was also a period of art colonies. There were lots of art colonies that were set up around America in the 1920s and 30s, which were places where artists could go in residence to paint, to find themselves in paint. What's interesting is that a lot of these art colonies were spread over the American West. The American landscape always has been a source of inspiration. That's why we had the Hudson River School. And so you're going to have a lot of these art colonies set up in America. Interestingly enough, again, shout out to Springville. Springville, Utah is a town that's just south of where I live here. And so if you're, again, a student in Orem or Provo, listening to this from Utah, you should know that Springville was one of these art colonies. And that's why the Springville Art Museum is there today. I also have to give a shout out to Alpine, Texas. Alpine, Texas was where Sul Ross State is located. It was one of these art colonies as well. And so there were lots of different artists exploring and experimenting. And they were taking some of the lessons of what was being done in Europe, but they're technically going to focus more on things like landscape and on what we would call Americana, unique American themes. One of those examples is John Stuart Curry. John Stuart Curry was active in Kansas, not in New York City, and he ends up painting things like this, a baptism, a kind of genre scene, with this wide open prairie. He would also do a series of paintings about the infamous John Brown. John Brown was the crazy minister who was a radical minister and a radical abolitionist who went to Kansas. That's why Kansas became Bloody Kansas, because there was a fight over whether Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. And so the forces of both sides met up in Kansas. And so this eventually became, in the 1850s, one of the precursors to what would happen in the Civil War, which was this tragic moment in American history. So here is John Brown with the Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, and then you have the tornadoes and the fire and also the pioneers and then the precursors to what would be the Civil War. That's why this is called the Tragic Prelude. So this regionalism is kind of marked by a very highly stylized form, exaggerated forms, and dealing with kind of symbolic elements. Probably the most famous of all the regionalist painters who was active in Iowa and the Midwest is going to be Grant Wood. Grant Wood was influenced by a whole series of folk painters. So folk painting was really a very big phenomenon in the United States. There wasn't a lot of places to get formal artistic training in America, particularly not in the vast bulk interior of America. Almost all of the places you could get training were in the coasts and the big cities. So if you were in the interior and you wanted to paint a scene, you had to be pretty much self-trained. And of course, folk art tended to be flatter. It tended to have an almost fairy tale-like quality with inaccurate perspectives. Grant Wood was a trained artist, but he liked these primitive, authentic elements of folk art, and he incorporated them into his landscapes. So you can see how this is simplified and stylized. I love how these little trees are all like perfect little spheres. They're quite beautiful. And of course, he blended this with a fair amount of Americana, the story of American history. This is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And so we have Paul Revere racing down this landscape. This feels very much like 14th century Trecento pieces by Martini or Ambrogio Lorenzetti or others, the Limburg brothers. This is the American equivalent to that, with its kind of tipped up perspective and its flattened landscapes and its little kind of cliche cute little trees. But it fit perfectly with that. One of my favorite paintings by him is this. This is the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Now, I hope you don't believe that story is true. According to American legend, when George Washington was a very young boy, he cut down his father's cherry tree. And his father found it and went to his son and said, "Son, did you cut down this cherry tree?" And George Washington realized that he was going to get in big trouble for this, but his honesty was too important to him. His integrity was too important. He said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree." Well, that story never happened. It's just a complete lie. But the story was made popular. It was a kind of American myth told by Parson Weem. Parson Weem was a moralist and a writer in early American history who told lots of these kind of fables to kind of give people a sense of the American character and as a way of imbuing moral character into their children's upbringing. And so the story is popularly recounted even today, even though it's not true. And here's Grant Wood's take on it. What I love about it is that everything about this is so deliciously fake, so perfectly fake, that it illustrates why the whole story is fake. Well, first of all, let's take a look at George. George is supposed to be a young boy, but he has a head as everybody remembers him. And of course, this is taken from Gilbert Stuart's very famous unfinished painting of George Washington, the most famous portrait of George Washington. So automatically you know that this thing is kind of bizarre. When you look at the rendition, the surfaces are too smooth. It has this divisionist technique. It's very similar to a Seurat in some ways. Here is Parson Weem, and of course he is pointing to the scene of his fable. But what I love is that he pulls back the curtain on the fable, but notice that the curtain has a fringe, and the fringe is identical to the cherries hanging off of the tree. The tree is, of course, completely artificial. Grant Wood was known for doing stuff like this, for creating things that had multiple levels that both extolled the American character, but at the same time let you know things were not quite right. One of the ones is the inclusion of people of African heritage here in the background, who of course would have been slaves to George Washington and his family. So there is a kind of moralizing tale there that, we're extolling the virtues of George Washington, but Grant Wood was making it very apparent that George Washington and his virtues also had complications and problems in its history. Our founding fathers were great men in many ways, but also they were men of their times, and something that we can't get away from is the reality of that. Grant Wood's most famous painting, of course, is going to be this painting, American Gothic. This is often interpreted as, a couple, but when it was originally created, it was conceived as a farmer and his daughter, although that one has been challenged. He said himself that he saw a house with this Gothic window, this typical carpenter Gothic window that you see in a lot of homes across the American interior, and he imagined the kind of people that would live there. And so he created this stoic couple. Now, I don't know where you live, but I remember when in my youth, that in Hurricane, Utah, and yes, that's how you say it. You're supposed to say Hurricane as close to one syllable as you can. Hurricane is a small town in southern Utah. We would go into the store, and there would be farmers that would come in with the suit coat over their bib overalls like this. So there is a certain amount of authenticity to this. But what I want to point out is that these characters are clearly characters. They're even caricatures of Americana, of the ideal stoic, American farmer and perhaps his wife or daughter. And this wasn't even true at the time that Grant Wood painted it. In fact, these are the people that he based this on. And one was, I believe, his sister, but the other one was, I think, his dentist. So they were both professional people in his life, and he used them as the models, but he cast them in this kind of quaint, folksy, rural setting. So he himself is having a dialogue with the idea of what America is versus the reality of what it is. So much interpretation has been made of this. She has this one loose lock, which people wonder, what is going on here? And of course he holds a pitchfork, which is often associated with images of the underworld and devil. And so people have often interpreted this as, is this a kind of American retelling of the rape of Persephone by Hades? Who knows? It's really, really hard to get a sense of it. But I think it shows how complex these regional ideas are, that they were taking American tropes and playing with them even then. And that brings us to Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton was another one of these American painters and muralists active in New York, and he painted scenes of rural life and in the American Midwest and in the American West. He had a kind of dynamic energy to himself, to his figures. They have this wonderful expressive quality, attenuated figure. He made these beautiful kind of murals that showed the full dynamic range of what American life was like. And again, it's a kind of caricature. We have stockbrokers, we have people in a nightclub, people watching a movie, people at a soda shop, or enjoying a circus, a whole variety of people, including, workers or health workers here. Some of these can be kind of stereotypical. He did a lot of murals for post offices and banks and public buildings. He was very active in the Work Projects Administration. The Work Project Administration was part of Roosevelt's New Deal program, and in the New Deal program they hired artists to decorate public buildings. A lot of the artists of the 30s, 40s, and 50s came through the Work Project Administration. So he painted this one, and this one is now in the New Britain Museum of Art, but it had a series of paintings from various different regions, and they were all named the Arts of the West, the Arts of the East, the Arts of the South, etc. I have to pick this one out because this is the Arts of the West, and I find this one hilarious. As someone who's lived in the West most of his life, I can tell you that it's all just hoedowns and rodeos and horseshoe and shooting. It's just like that is. Well, again, this is Americana. This is not what life was like even in the 1930s. Even in the 1930s, this is a kind of caricature or romanticized caricature of American life. He too would take on kind of older subjects. This is again an American view of the story of Hades and Persephone. And in this case, Persephone is depicted as a woman who has decided to take a bath by a stream, and Hades, instead of being lord of the underworld, he is a kind of creepy old man who has come up upon this scene. But when we look at this, again, it has the flattened perspective. When we look at regionalism, it borrows many of the styles and forms of surrealism. But America has this much stronger rooted tradition to realism. It's something that we believe is kind of part of our history. It has a much stronger tradition of landscape painting. And Americana, obviously, has a very strong sense of itself. So these are surrealistic in that they do have this almost dreamlike quality. You can see this in Benton's landscapes as well, that they have this kind of bizarre dreamlike quality, but ultimately they are in service to this kind of American ideal. Likewise, we have painters that are expressing their own kind of identity. This one is Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper was active in New England, and he's most famous for painting these scenes of kind of quiet life, of individuals that are completely isolated by modern life. This has a woman at an automat. An automat was a place where you could go and get pre-made food, fast food, put a nickel in a machine, open up a door, and there would be your slice of pie or whatever. And you can see that she is all alone. We have the reflections in the window of the automat, but she's just kind of surrounded by darkness. The most famous painting of this series is Nighthawks. This thing has been reappropriated. This thing is so recognizable in pop culture. And of course, I've seen this with every iteration, with every kind of geek pop reference or a figure put in here. I've seen these figures replaced by Elvis and Marilyn Monroe, and I've also seen them replaced with, Spock and Doctor Who. It becomes such a piece of Americana, it's so easy to retool. But what's interesting is that even though he's normally thought of as a realist painter, is you look at these scenes, they're very flat, they're very empty. There's a spareness to them, both in the style. Notice how much you can see the brushstrokes. There's not a lot of paint here, but also a spareness in the composition. It gives a sense of isolation, a sense of loneliness. This one is actually my favorite of these paintings. This one is a New York theater, and this woman here with her fantastic shoes is an usher, and she's holding under one arm a flashlight. Theater was a major part of American life. Who knows, maybe theaters won't survive the pandemic. But even I remember as a kid that, theaters didn't just have one or two movies. There would be short subjects in front of them. Cartoons in front of movies have kind of come back recently, thanks to a few animation studios. But it used to be that, the theater would just run all day long. And, there was the main feature, the big movie, but there were serials, short little pulp fiction kind of stories about Flash Gordon, or sometimes newsreels, or sometimes cartoons. And you could come in at any moment. You could go in and sit down, buy a ticket, watch the newsreel before your show started, or just show up for the show itself, and you knew when that came. Well, they wouldn't turn the house lights on and off every time that happened, because that would disturb the people who were watching the movie. So instead, if you came in, there would be some person, young man or a young lady, who with a flashlight would direct you to your seat. And here she is wearing her uniform and her fabulous shoes to let you know, and she's sitting here by the side, so as somebody comes down the stairs, she can direct them to an open or available seat. But what I love about this is that these people over here are having a night out. They're having this wonderful, communal experience, sharing in the mystery and in the majesty of the theater. But she can't see that. She's completely cut off. She's a working girl. It's probably lower class. And for that, she seems distant. I love how the composition creates the sense of both mystery, but also detachment and loneliness as well. It also should be noted that this period, the 30s through the 40s and 50s, was the era of the great American illustrators. And I don't want to talk about these guys too much because they'll be covered in other classes if you take the history of illustration. But many of these artists have fallen by the wayside in the study of fine arts because they were regarded as illustrator. An illustrator, of course, is somebody who does things for magazines or covers or whatever, and was therefore seen as a commercial artist. But many of these artists, their legacy has continued to rise, and I think they will rise. It's funny, when I was a kid, people wouldn't even talk about Norman Rockwell in art history because they thought it was beneath them. But Norman Rockwell has seen a kind of elevated station as he goes on. He has many of these same kind of features of fakeness, of, kind of caricatures of American life, but done in a loving way. The way I like to think of Norman Rockwell is that he's kind of the equivalent to a Jan Steen or to Bruggen from the Dutch period. He really loved the Dutch masters, and like them, they liked to paint genre scenes. So he painted genre scenes, but he painted American genre scenes. And so they're unique to the American character. This, of course, is a Thanksgiving scene, and this is Freedom from Want. There's a very important speech given by Franklin Roosevelt where he described the four freedoms, and the four freedoms were freedom from fear, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom from want. And Norman Rockwell illustrated all four. And so the upright orientation here was because it had to fit the magazines that these were going to be printed in. But I love this because as you look at this, you'll notice that, my gosh, the plates are really spare. The depiction here is really kind of flat. The table tips up too high. I don't know how far this guy has to lean over the table. These people, their heads are crowded too in. He wanted a busy, happy family, so he kind of violates rules of perspective and anatomy to cram them in there. It's a kind of fake scene. And again, much like earlier artists, it has a kind of artificiality to it. So I think he fits right into this same time period. Same thing could be said for Maxfield Parrish. Maxfield Parrish was kind of ignored for many years. He was a very successful illustrator. But then Maxfield Parrish has been elevated in status over the last several years. He had a major show at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts back in the 90s, and it kind of reminded people, yeah, that's why we like him. Again, you can see that he deals in these kind of fantasy landscapes. He illustrated a lot of stories and calendars, etc. But the lightness of it, the ethereal quality of the light. And of course the same could be true of Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth is one of the few illustrators of the Brandywine School, this region of Pennsylvania where you had a group of artists there, and he was known as predominantly an illustrator during his life, but now everybody recognizes he's probably one of the great American painters. But even though this scene is very realistic, it does have that characteristic strangeness and flatness that a lot of the regionalism of the era has. It does seem rather dreamlike. So surrealism is having an impact even on the realist painters in a way. There's a couple of other innovations in America we want to talk about, and one of them is straight photography. So straight photography is an innovation in photography that breaks away from both the pictorial style, where you would kind of stage a painting or a scene or a narrative, and the documentary style, where you just try to capture whatever it is in front of you. So if you remember, Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen had created the photo secession, and they were used to painting in a kind of, they were not painting, shooting photographs in a documentary style. That is, they would go out with the camera and kind of capture things. And this was the kind of stuff that they were producing. Even this is a little bit staged. So all of you first-year photography students who think you're so great because you do Venetian blinds and the shadows of Venetian blinds falling over your subjects, yeah, get over yourself. That cliche is so old. So old! Oh my gosh! Stop doing it. Anyhow, so Alfred Stieglitz was making stuff like this. He was like shooting trolleys in the street, or he was shooting scenes like this. This is almost a kind of recreation of a Dutch interior. Woman is working at a letter. There's a bird cage. There's, Valentines on the wall. There's a light coming from the left. So these are very much kind of narrative-driven scenes. And another photographer, a young photographer at the time, by the name of Paul Strand, had made a series of photographs, and Alfred Stieglitz and Steichen had been rather harsh with him. And they said, yeah, this stuff is no dang good. You need to go and you need to find your own style on this. And they sent him away, and then Paul Strand came back, and he came back with a portfolio, and he dropped it on Stieglitz's desk, and he said, I don't know if I've gone crazy or not. I've taken some new pictures, and I want you to take a look at them. And Stieglitz didn't have much expectations for it, but he opened the portfolio, and it was stuff like this. This is Wall Street, but of course, it's not Wall Street. It's, a series of open windows or spaces and figures beneath them. And as Stieglitz began to move through this portfolio, he became more and more perplexed and more intrigued. These were not photos of people or narratives. They weren't documentary because they weren't recording anything. They were pure studies in light and form. That is, they were taking in the lessons of what abstract painters were doing with painting and applying them to photography. Is this the story of a woman crossing the street? She's kind of a counterpoint, really. It's really the story of the interplay of light and shadow. And Stieglitz said, wow, this is something new. And so this was more or less the birth of what we call straight photography, where the photographer, again, we had broken away from the pictorial style where you stage everything in front of the camera. And then we had moved into kind of a more documentary style where you use the camera to capture the composition. But this was even more so. This was not capturing a composition, this was capturing light and shadow. Paul Strand started taking photos of chairs and, bowls, and sometimes tires. And when you look at a photo like this, you can't even make out the bowls. All you can make out are the various forms. It becomes a pure composition. And Stieglitz realized this was really big. This was new. And so Stieglitz himself started picking up on this same style and did a whole series he called the Equivalent series, where he was taking pictures of clouds in the sky. Can't get any more abstract than that. And this form of straight photography really started to take off, where what you were taking pictures of really was irrelevant. It didn't matter what you were taking a picture of. It didn't need to be documentary. We'd already jumped to, you frame the composition in the camera. You don't do it in the studio, you do it in the camera. The camera is your tool. You take the camera and you find the shot. You don't make the shot, you find the shot. And this was even more so. This was like, screw it. We're not about narratives or documenting things. We're about, composition, light and shadow. This really takes off on the West Coast, and we get a whole series of West Coast photographers, Edward Weston being one of them, who tackle their subject matter in exactly the same way. And it doesn't matter if they're looking at a pepper or a nude, that they treat it in the same sensitive way. The subject matter is irrelevant. It becomes a composition of light and shadow. And a lot of these artists started moving out into America. So much like the regionalist artists were popping up Midwest, Southwest, wherever, same thing with the photographers. You didn't need to stick around in New York or San Francisco. They started moving out into the American Southwest, and this is when the American Southwest becomes a major art center and market. People don't believe it, but Santa Fe, I think, is the third largest art market after New York and LA in America. It's huge. And it's largely because artists started moving out there. Of course, George O'Keeffe settled in that region, Taos, and so again, you find the composition. And it's really, it's completely different than the kind of manipulated photographs of Man Ray, but they're really kind of elegant and beautiful, and this is what the tradition Ansel Adams comes out of. We also, at the same time, have a rise in this kind of social realism that is taking place. We have photographers like Lang who are working with the Agricultural Office to document migrant workers in the midst of the Great Depression. And so you see these same sensibilities, these compositional strengths, but now being brought to document humans and their plight. And finally, there's American abstraction. Americans were keenly aware of the experiments that were happening in Europe, but they were a little slower on picking them up. And again, America remains a little bit more diverse than Europe in a way. You have the regionalists, we have these wide variety of creators. The first who picks up on this is going to be Arthur Dove, and Arthur Dove picks up first on pure abstraction, much in the same way that the Cubists and the Futurists were doing, and he's even inspired by the works of, say, the Dadaists to incorporate collage or print. So here he is using print to make The Critic, 1925. You see this same kind of creation of kind of emblems in the works of Marsden Hartley. This was Marsden Hartley's partner, Karl van Freyberg, who was a German lieutenant who died during the first few months of the First World War. And so he creates this homage to him, but instead of creating a figure, he creates what appears to be a chest full of medals, a variety of patriotic flags and emblems that come together to represent him. That's very similar to the kind of abstraction that existed both in Cubism and Futurism. But America comes up with its own unique forms of abstraction as well, and the person most responsible for that is Charles Demuth. Charles Demuth he's active mostly in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but also New York. Trains at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and also in Paris. And he is the founder of Precisionism, and Precisionism is the American response to Cubism and Futurism and Suprematism, taking these kind of pure geometric elements and breaking them down. And it always remains figurative, but it's going to be, again, a way of interpreting or analyzing space, breaking it up. So here you have a sail. This is one of my favorites. This is My Egypt. In this view, we have a little touch of Americana. This is a grain silo. The American Midwest and the open interiors of America are full of these things, and these colossal monuments. And so Demuth is, for Americans, it's the landscape, or it's your kind of great industrial or agricultural achievements. They were to him what Egypt was to others, like the obelisks and monuments and pylons of ancient Egypt. And here you can see he breaks it up in these lines, giving it a sense of the direction of light. Perhaps my favorite is I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold. This is a piece that is a interpretation of a poem by a good friend of his, William Carlos Williams. William Carlos Williams wrote this poem about a fire engine. And as the fire engine goes through the rainy streets, the thing that really hangs in your mind is the red 5. That's why the name of it is called I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire trek, moving tense, unheeded, to gong clang, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. And so he interprets this poem, and he focuses in on the number 5. So much like the Dadaists were, and the Cubists were using letters, and the Futurists were using letters and words to highlight certain things, he highlights this. He even incorporates his friend's name. So there's Bill. You can see there's Carlos, there's WCW and CD, his initials, and William Carlos Williams' initials. You can see the axle as it speeds through, and the precisionism is really good in showing the energy and the movement of the light. And you can see the 5 as it speeds away into the distance. Likewise, individuals like Charles Sheeler were painting interiors of, painting scenes of American cities that were so simplified that they had become rendered abstract shapes. Beautiful kind of compilations of abstract shapes, taking some of the lessons of the Cubists, the Futurists, etc., a little bit more simple, but there's no way to kind of pull these into an actual city. Sometimes you're looking down on things, sometimes you're looking across from things, so it has that multiple perspective of Cubism, but still conveys the city. And then there's Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was initially the lover of Alfred Stieglitz, and then eventually his wife. And she was a young artist that wrote to Alfred Stieglitz, and then eventually became her mentor, and then eventually the lover. And she was also moving in that same direction, moving towards abstraction, first creating pure abstractions, and then moving into kind of forms that were either suggested by floral motifs or were actual kind of abstract renderings of flowers. A lot of these have forms that are very suggestive of vaginas and female genitalia, and a lot of people have made a lot out of that because she was such a prominent female artist, but as near as I know, she denied all those associations. She was actually just looking for kind of pure form. She too applied that kind of abstraction to scenes of American cities. This is the Radiator Building in New York City at night. And it comes this very powerful dynamic, but also flat and kinetic thing. Eventually she would move to the American Southwest, and she would pull in the American Southwest, features of the American Southwest, the cow skull, blending them with landscapes and scenes of her flowers. And so they were both abstract, but also very surrealistic, pulling these in as symbols and emblems. And so we kind of end where we started at the beginning, that surrealism allows peoples to explore their own internal imagery and their own internal selves. And a lot of the artists, even if they were working abstractly, were moving in that direction, creating paintings of incredible meaning. Of course, things in the 1930s do not end well. By 1938, World War II has started or is imminent, and Poland is invaded, and then ultimately the whole world tumbles into chaos. And then in 1941, on December 7th, the bombing of Pearl Harbor brings America into the war, and there's a kind of a pause, frankly. The world is focused on the war effort, and so, art takes a back seat. art was, kind of artists pulled together for the war effort, and many of them took on more practical duties, but the war kind of occupies everybody's conscience. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, all of the things that are bubbling up beneath the surface, this psycho-automatism, abstraction, all of these things come together to create this kind of triumphal moment, which we call abstract expressionism. And it happens not in Europe. It happens in New York, and forever cements kind of New York in particular, but America in general, as the new active center of the art world. America, in many ways, benefits from all these refugees and exiles who are leaving Europe and come to America. And we'll talk about that next time. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.